If you only know the Morrigan as a war goddess or as a crow or as a kind of dark, spooky, feminine archetype that you can wear like a cloak, then I want you to hear this line and let it do its job. Cuchulainn saw a young woman coming towards him with a dress of every colour on and her form very excellent. And that's from Faraday's translation of the Táin Bó Cúailnge. The job of that line I'm putting right here at the start of this podcast episode is to disrupt the neat little boxes that modern culture tries to put the Morrigan in. Because the primary texts that we actually work from at the Morrigan Academy are not interested in giving you a tidy character profile. They're there to show you what happens when she enters the story and how the hero, or the anti-hero in Cuchulainn's case, responds when he doesn't have the control that he thinks he has. So this is the Morrigan Academy Podcast. I am Reverend Lora O'Brien, MA, and today we are revisiting a basic question that comes up again and again, both for brand new listeners and people new to the Morrigan or my work, and for people who've been around the block with Irish gods for years. And that question is simply, who is the Morrigan really, once you strip the modern fantasy myths away and stop trying to make her fit whatever you already believe? Now, some of you will be surprised by this and some of you really won't, but I'm going to say something really blunt early on because it saves time and it saves heartache, both yours and mine, and it's this. Most people meet an image or a projection of the Morrigan first, not the actual goddess Morrigan. And they stay loyal to that image, sometimes for years. And then they wonder why their practice feels blocked, or why nothing responds, or why everything feels sharp and destabilising, or why they keep chasing signs that never land, or why Laura O'Brien is pissed off at them. Now, that does not mean that you're broken, and it doesn't mean that she's absent or unavailable. It usually means that you're approaching her through a modern lens that has nothing to do with Irish tradition. And that lens quietly trains you to treat gods as symbols or therapists or aesthetic brands or spiritual accessories. And the Morrigan doesn't tolerate that for long because she is not built for it. She is not here for that, I can tell you that much. So when we talk about stripping the fantasy away, I don't mean sneering at people who are trying their best. And please don't hear me in that way, because that's not what this is about. And I don't mean mocking beginners, because everybody starts somewhere. And plenty of people start with misinformation, and they are still completely sincere. Addressing the misinformation that's out there about the Morrigan and about Irish traditions more generally is literally the number one mission that she put me on 25 years ago when I started contractually working for her. Get real information out there. And that has been my life's work ever since. So I am not in any way mocking or sneering at people who have come across all this misinformation and believed it with the best of intentions, right? But what I do mean is that if you want right relationship, you need to be honest about where your ideas come from. And you need to be willing to let some of them die, honestly, because some of them were never meant to be alive in the first place. So let's go through a few of the common distortions quickly and plainly, because they're everywhere. And if you have fallen foul of any of these, again, no shame, no shade. Please just realign, pick yourself up, and just start to do the work from authentic sources. Please, 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 please. So there's the version of the Morrigan who is basically a generic war goddess, a kind of Irish female version of Ares. And yes, technically, she is a war goddess or a battle goddess, really. But if you stop there, you miss most of what she is actually doing in the literature, because she's not only present in conflict and, fighting herself, but she's also shaping conflict. And she's shaping it through direct intervention prior to the conflict, through her sovereignty, presence and actions, through prophecy, through incitement, and through consequence, which is a very different thing from simply being a patron of violence. Now, there is the version of the Mórrígan that is all crows and omens and spooky vibes and dark goddess nonsense. And of course, she's associated with battle and death and the aftermath of violence. This is true, right? But if you treat her as a crow costume, you end up chasing birds instead of actually doing the work, and you completely miss the point, right? Now, the one that pisses me off the most. There is a version of her that's been sexualized into a fantasy queen, some kind of, mommy-dommy. And I'm going to be very direct. That one is often soaked in this modern male gaze, pornified goddess culture, and it is miles away from Irish sources and from my own lived reality with the Morrigan, just by the by. But we're sticking to the sources here. And it really, the whole fantasy element, whether it's kind of sexual or not, it really sets people up to think that devotion is about being chosen, or the chosen one specifically, or being desired, or being special. And that is a very short road to spiritual performance, not actual relationship. And then there's the very common kind of softer distortion, the one that looks to be emotionally intelligent on the surface, where she becomes this dark goddess personal empowerment archetype, like a shadow work mirror, a trauma goddess, a comforting mother, a guide who exists to affirm your identity and validate your feelings and, empower you in your dark goddess form, whatever that happens to be, right? And I want to be really careful here because, again, this is probably the most common one these days. And people are often reaching for safety when they do this, or even when they teach this, bless their hearts, they're not doing it with bad intent, and I totally understand that. But the result is still the same, and it makes her into something that she's just not. And then people either feel abandoned when she doesn't behave in that way, like, why has the Morrigan forsaken me? So common to hear. Or they interpret every inner mood swing as her voice, and both of those outcomes are a complete hot mess, So if you want to know who the Morrigan actually is, you watch what she does in the stories, and you take seriously what the stories are showing you about power and consequence, and you learn about the context of those stories and what was actually going on beyond the surface reading that our modern minds can give it. And you really have to stop expecting a goddess to play this role that you need her to be in, or that you have assigned to her, either through ignorance or, again, your own projection. So that's why I opened with that line from the Táin material, from Faraday's translation of it, because it shows you the Morrigan arriving not as a symbol, not as a crow, not as a battle cry, but she's chosen to shapeshift into a young woman of remarkable presence, richly clothed. And when you read that passage, not just the line, the conversation that follows really makes the point even harder, because Cú Chulainn in his arrogance, speaks to her not as a excuse me, not as a sovereignty goddess offering him her allyship, right? But he speaks to her as though she's just a sexy woman turning up at an inconvenient time. And she responds not by pleading and not by flattering him and not by making herself small or any of that, but by stating consequence and declaring how she will interfere with him in combat. He has made the wrong choice. He has put a perception on her that was unwarranted. In his ignorance and his arrogance, he has chosen to eschew the advances, to reject the advances or the potential for right relationship with a sovereignty goddess. And again, just for an example of how this is often misconstrued in modern myths, and a lot of people now read that and they will see something along the lines of, or will say something along the lines of, the Morrigan is a sex goddess, and then when Cuchulainn spurns her advances, she gets spiteful and angry and threatens him, because she's in love with him or something. And unfortunately, this is everything from scholars to most, English or American authors who are reading, who have gotten around to reading the original text. They are misreading them, unfortunately, because they don't have the context. So understanding that passage, understanding that line, understanding what's actually happening there, or at least beginning to get a little insight into the nature of the Morrigan and also the nature of Cuchulainn as we look at him. That's a doorway into reality, because in this passage you see like several things happening at once. You see that the goddess moves through different forms. You see that she's not limited to one face. She is a shapeshifter. You see that the Morrigan is not there to be understood. She's there to act. Relationship is important to her. You see that she is willing to approach this war leader, this supposed sovereign in nature or action, supposed to be a hero. She's willing to approach him directly because it's an important point in a very big, life-changing battle that's happening, or a life-changing, situation. And she is always there at the key points. And you also see that his refusal doesn't end the encounter. She doesn't slink away with her tail between her legs. It escalates it, because refusal doesn't remove consequence. It simply changes the shape of it. So this is why I keep saying that the Irish sources show you function, not a tidy definition. You have to be familiar enough with them to actually comprehend or begin to comprehend some of what's happening within a seemingly simple quote or passage. Now, in the rest of the Ulster cycle material, the Morrigan is entangled with the events that lead to conflict and the events that shape the outcome of conflict. She warns, she incites, she interferes, she foretells, she mocks, which is also a form of incitement, she challenges. She is not a passive observer. She's not a mascot crow that sits on your shoulder. She is a force that presses on the places where humans pretend they have control. Hear that again. She is a force that presses on the places where humans pretend that we have control. And this is the part that modern fantasy projections often can't stand to hear. She doesn't show up to reassure you that you're doing great. She doesn't exist to give you a spiritual identity badge. She's not a reward for devotion. And she's not like a vending machine for signs that, boost your ego or tell you that you're on the right track. What she does tend to do, please forgive my voice, what she does tend to do again and again in myth and also in my own lived practice again, is force a confrontation with what is real and what is necessary, the necessary change that needs to happen. Now, that can look like conflict, but it's not always outer conflict. Sometimes it's inner conflict, like the battle between what you say you value and how you actually live. Sometimes it's the conflict between the person that you perform in public and the truth that you avoid in private. Sometimes it's the conflict between your longing for power and your fear of responsibility, because those two things live together in a lot of people. And the Morrigan is very good at making you see that. And I don't mean power in necessarily a negative way. It depends on, power itself is neutral. It depends on how you use it, obviously. You could say a longing for strength or leadership and a fear of responsibility. The Morrigan is very good at making you see that those things are in conflict. And all of this is why, like, when people come to me and say, I think I'm being called, but I feel blocked, I usually don't start with signs or omens. I start with the question of what story are they telling themselves about who she is, and whether that story comes from Irish tradition and who the Morrigan actually is, or from modern culture. Because if you're trying to build right relationship with the fantasy, then you will get fantasy results, which is to say confusion, projection, and a whole lot of noise with no substance, basically. So let's do something practical and keep it simple enough that it can be done by someone in a busy life, in any country, without pretending that you're living in a museum version of Ireland, because none of that shit is necessary. So here's a practice, right? It is a discernment practice, not a ritual, because discernment, or, figuring out what's real and what's not real, is one, or what's relevant and what's not relevant. Discernment is one of the most missing skills in modern goddess culture, honestly, in neo-paganism generally. And it is one of the most necessary skills if you want to be in right relationship with any being of power, but especially with the Morrigan. So take 5 minutes today, literally 5 minutes out of your day, and sit somewhere that you won't be interrupted. Put your phone away, put the performance away, and then ask yourself slowly, in a way that makes you uncomfortable if you've been avoiding reality, where am I clinging to an image of the Morrigan instead of responding to what is actually happening in my life? And when answers come, especially if they're uncomfortable, just sit with them. Don't argue with them. Don't justify. Don't turn it into a self-esteem exercise. Just notice, just be aware. Where am I clinging to an image of the Morrigan instead of responding to what's actually happening in my life? And then I want you to write this journal prompt, and I want you to write a real answer, not a pretty one. So what belief, image or expectation about the Morrigan might I need to let go of in order to meet her as she is, not as I want her to be? And if you do that honestly, you will find out very quickly whether your practice is relationship based or fantasy based, because fantasy hates questions like this and relationship requires questions like this. Now, I know I'm running long in this episode, but I'm going to keep going because there's a few more points that I want to make and I think it's important. So Stick with me. I have another little practical exercise for you, as well as looking at the lore again. But I really want to ground all of this in something else that modern culture tends to ignore, which is that Irish tradition is really not like a private self-improvement project, and your own Irish ancestry, looking at your connections, your roots, your heritage. It's a passion project for a lot of people, I understand that, and it's very, very important. But we are a living, breathing culture, a heritage, a whole culture, a whole society. And none of this that we have here is built around the isolated individual. Individualism is not really a thing in traditional Irish society. It's getting a little bit more so now as modern influences are interfering here, the same as they are everywhere else, right? But traditionally here, the isolated individual was kind of irrelevant in some ways, right? Because, they're here, they're floating in their own symbolism, their own self-importance. Like, you'd absolutely be taken down for notions if you started that now around Ireland, right? But what our culture and our heritage and our traditions are actually built around is land, community, obligation, ancestry, and right relationship with all of those things, and consequence. And even when we practice solo, we are practicing inside that ethical frame, which means that your relationship with the Mórrígan is not only about how you feel or what you want, it's about what you do and who pays the price when you don't do it. There's a responsibility there that's inherent, a community responsibility that a lot of people who aren't a part of Irish culture now really have forgotten, even if they have Irish ancestry. It wasn't a part of their family traditions as they were coming through, or they're heavily influenced by the colonizer culture that their ancestors settled in, and that's just become the norm now, the entitlement and the individualism, right? So that's why a lot of people try to soften her, because they want a goddess who will affirm them without asking anything of them. It's entitlement, it's individualism, it's please solve my problems, I have this need, right? But the Morrigan in our stories keeps coming back to the same pressure point. Are you fit to carry what you claim you want to carry? Are you fit to stand in conflict without collapsing into chaos? Are you fit for right relationship with a sovereignty goddess? Are you fit to speak truth without using truth as a weapon against the wrong people? One of the central premises is Fear Flaha, the sovereign's truth. And it's so, so important. Using words or truth as a weapon against the wrong people is anathema in Irish culture. So are you fit to hold sovereignty without turning it into control, without abusing it for your own, without going back to the negative side of wanting power and not wanting any responsibility? So if you hear any of those questions and you feel your stomach tighten, you're not doing it wrong. You're hearing her. And it's big, right? But let me just turn to a little primary text moment again. I really want to make this stuff kind of accessible and more understandable, because I know it's very dense when you're just trying to sit down and read the mythology. It's very, very dense, right? So most of my work is about trying to help you with that and interpret it and give you context and help you interpret it and help you find meaning in it, not me interpret it for you, right? But anyway, let's go back to this primary text moment, because it's doing more work than it might look like at first glance. So when the Táin gives us the scene of Cuchulainn seeing the young woman, the text isn't trying to romanticize her. It is establishing her presence. She's very striking. And it's establishing that she arrives fully herself, richly formed, and that she's not diminished by the hero's circumstances. And just point of note, as she arrives in this, dress and enticing form and gorgeously arrayed and all the rest of it, Cuchulainn at that point is standing up to his waist in literal shit in a river, having just, defeated an enemy whose bowels evacuated, basically. So that's a lovely piece of imagery for you. But this is how she arrives, and this is his position at the time. So, again, context, people. But she's not diminished by the hero's circumstances. She is still showing up. And it's an interesting kind of flip on a lot of the sovereignty stuff, where the sovereignty goddess is often portrayed as like the hag by the well, the ugly one that the brothers, all refuse to sleep with. And then the youngest brother, this is Niall of the Nine Hostages. This is his sovereignty story, just to be clear. I'm myth jumping currently, sorry. But Niall, the youngest brother, the least qualified of all the brothers to be king, is the one who offers her a kiss or to lie with her or whatever. So basically he looks beyond the physical and understands the power of what she has to offer. And this is an interesting flipped perspective, where Cuchulainn is the one who looks like shit, literally, and the Morrigan is the one who's coming, and still Cuchulainn can't see the power that is being offered to him. Still he can't look beyond his own situation and his own wants, his own needs, right? And then the whole kind of situation moves into negotiation and consequence, which really tells us that she's not there to be admired. She is there to engage. She's there to do her job. And when the engagement is refused, she doesn't fold, she escalates, and she names the consequences, and she names exactly how she's going to come against him in combat and feck him up, right? There is so much going on here. It's not a throwaway. It's not an aesthetic lesson. It is a relationship lesson. It is really, really showing Cuchulainn as the anti-hero. He is the shining example through this mythology of what not to do. He makes the worst choices at every feckin' turn, especially when it comes to the Morrigan and the sovereignty goddesses and his relationship with women generally, really. And it tells you that you now personally, that if you come to the Morrigan with entitlement, she's going to meet you with consequence. If you bring her arrogance, she is going to feck you up. She will test you. And if you come to her trying to control the terms, trying to make it about you, you're going to discover very quickly that that is not an option that's available to you at best, right? At best, you'll be ignored. And that's why for so many people, the first contact with the Morrigan feels like disruption, because the fantasy version offers comfort and the real version offers truth. And the truth often arrives first as discomfort. Because, we've been here in our nice warm bubble and our nice stable rut, and Guthuban, suddenly, we have to break out of it, or we're broken out of it. So here's a second practice. This one isn't about signs, it's about behaviour, because behaviour is where devotion becomes real. So pick one place in your life where you've been avoiding a necessary boundary. It can be small. It can be as simple as a conversation you keep putting off, or a habit you keep excusing, or a commitment you keep breaking to yourself, or a resentment you keep feeding because it feels easier than change. And then you make one clear move towards sovereignty in that place. One move. Not a grand transformation, not life-changing dramatic consequences. One move that you can sustain. And if you want to connect that to the Morrigan without theatre, then you do it like this. You speak one sentence aloud before you act, and that sentence is to be honest and, again, not dramatic. We talked a lot about right relationship in last week's episode, so please go back and listen to that as well. But you can speak a sentence such as, I will not hand my power away here. That's a very simple boundary. It's brief, and that's it. And then you act. And when you're setting boundaries, just to be very clear, the boundary is not a punishment, and it's not anything to do with the other person or even the situation. It's about you. And, if you are being expected to hand away your power, then it's on you to walk away from that situation and to respect your own boundaries, not on everybody else to jump to it. Again, that's a very individualistic way of looking at things, a very entitled way of looking at things, and we're trying to get away from that here. So this is how you strip the fantasy away, because fantasy loves dramatic devotions and hates ordinary responsibility and work. And the Morrigan, in my experience, values the opposite. She expects us to do the work. Now, I want to speak directly to the listener who is thinking, I'm not Irish, I'm far away, I don't have access to language or land or teachers. How am I meant to understand the Irish culture, the Irish context, the old texts? It's too hard, right? You don't solve any of that by pretending you're Irish. You don't solve it by grabbing Irish symbols and calling it lineage, calling yourself Irish. You don't solve it by practicing restraint. You do solve it by practicing restraint, by listening more than you speak, by being honest about your distance, by centering native Irish voices and experience, and by being willing to learn from true, correct, authentic sources rather than from, witch talk or vibe-based culture, right? Right relationship is not about taking, it's about relating, and relating includes limits and boundaries. Any healthy relationship includes limits and boundaries. So if you are far away, your work is still real, but it needs to be accountable, it needs to be authentic, it needs to be grounded, and it needs to refuse the easy fantasy touristy approach where Irish gods are treated like open access commodities, pick and mix jars on a shelf of sweeties that you can just come in and take what you want out of, right? Now, that refusal and that boundary that I'm setting here isn't gatekeeping. It's about respect, and it's about you getting the real benefits from right relationship with the Morrigan, because that's what I want for you. So if you don't want that, then by all means turn me off and go and pick up a book on the Dark Goddess and do your bit, right? Grand. But this is one of the biggest reasons that I run the Morrigan Academy the way I do, because the internet is full of very confident nonsense about the Morrigan, and the results are predictable. People get spooked. People get inflated. Their egos come, oh my goodness, the emails I've been getting. Or people get confused and they call it spirituality, when most of the time it's just projection with maybe some better branding, right? So let me bring this to a close. Finally, it's gone on a bit, but hopefully it's been of value to you. There's 2 whole practices in there and a journaling prompt, right? But I want to bring it to a close in a way that's like clear and steady. So, who is the Morrigan? She is not your aesthetic. She is not your archetype. She is not your comfort or therapy goddess. She is not your excuse to be dramatic and the centre of attention. And she is not your permission slip to turn Irish tradition into content for your own either financial or social gain, right? Because that's literal cultural appropriation if you're not here in Ireland. She is a force of sovereignty and consequence. She engages where there's conflict, where there's pressure, where truth needs to be told. She is a satirist, remember. And there's a whole thing about that. Maybe I'll do a podcast episode on satire. Maybe I have done already, actually. She acts in the stories through warning, through prophecy, through interference, through incitement, and through transformation, both of form and of circumstance. And the actual original texts show her again and again as an autonomous being who does not need your belief, but who absolutely responds to your behaviour and your integrity and your continuity of showing up and trying your best to develop a responsible, right relationship. So, after all that, if you want a grounded source-based guide that helps you and others learn the reality of who she is, my book is available wherever you get your books. It is The Mórrígan, Ireland's Goddess. And if you found this episode useful, you can help by leaving a review, or if you've read the book, please leave a review so that more people can find something solid instead of drifting into modern distortions. So please review, comment, share it to groups, send it to someone who has this fantasy idea of the Mórrígan, who needs to hear some truth. Maybe. This is the Morrigan Academy Podcast. I am Lora O'Brien, and I will see you next time. Slán go fóill.